Something very strange seems to be going on inside of national parks in North America. Every year, hundreds of people go missing in these parks, but these parks are huge expanses of wilderness. So it's not particularly unusual that people might go missing inside of them. But every year, of those hundreds of people that go missing, there's always a few that go missing under very strange circumstances. Either the way in which they disappeared doesn't really add up. Someone will be watching or keeping an eye on someone, they'll turn around and then turn back and that person's missing and there's not a trace of them and they're never found again. Or you'll have instances of someone will go missing, there'll be an extensive search, there's no trace of them, and then they're found like miles and miles away in locations that are almost impossible to get to. Now, one man, David Paulides, who's a former police detective, he began researching these very strange disappearances inside of national parks. It started when a park ranger actually approached him and said, "Hey, there's a bunch of weird things happening in state parks. You should look into it because you're a former detective." And so after looking into it, he discovered that there were so many oddities around many of these strange disappearances. And he saw there was many overlaps and similarities that he really dove into it. And he's examined thousands of these strange cases. By his count, 10,000 plus hours of research. He's written 4 books. They're all under the name Missing 411. If you Google Missing 411, you'll find a plethora of information about these cases. He has 2 documentaries out. And so David, while he doesn't actually take a stance as to, what's causing these strange disappearances, anybody that follows along with the Missing 411 cases is basically led to believe that something is hunting humans in North America inside of national parks. It is fascinating, it is terrifying, and I've picked out 5 of the most bizarre cases that I've come across inside of Missing 411. Before we get into those 5 stories though, if this is the type of content that you're interested in, the strange, dark, and mysterious that I've kind of promised in this video, well, that's what my channel is all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your style and you like that type of content, if you could, please gently lambast the like button and then please turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the stories. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father, and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always used, they set up, they have a wonderful first night, they camp out, and the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there. And so this camper had kids as well, and he asked Dennis's father, "Hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons, and they can just play together." Dennis's father says, "Sure, bring them down." And so the man goes, gets his kids, they come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance, but watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point, the parents say, "Okay, show yourselves." And all the kids, except for Dennis, show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, "Come on out," and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, "Dennis, come out, Dennis. I know you're behind the tree." And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods, screaming for his son. And he actually ends up running almost 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they're thinking like, he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, like, "I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree." And so they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history, ensues with 1,500 searchers that included the Army Green Berets, so the special forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing. There is no trace. There's no scent. There is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father and they're like, you have to tell us what you saw. Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into thin air? But no one knew. That was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone, and they never knew what happened to him. Years later, when David Paulides was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case, he interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family. And they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear. And so they head over there and they're looking for bears. And one of their children hears a scream, or thinks he hears a scream, and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain, so you could kind of see in between the trees. And they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human the way it was running. It looked, hairy and like an animal, but it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this, what looked like a child over its shoulder. It acted almost like a human. And so you have a bear man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the Dennis Martin case. And obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just, saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So, it never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the Missing 411 cases that it was ever connected. But there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing. In the spring of 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a cursory search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find several hours later some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith. Surprisingly, Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground and being 2 years old, he wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened, he's 2 years old, he had said a cat scratched him, and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. That was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old, in the span of 20 hours, could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished outdoorsman, he's the star, he is Survivor Man, he actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. You have 20 hours to cover this 12 miles, and he couldn't do it. And he even said, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And, years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man, he was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea. He has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCullough, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery. And by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had an all-terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which was this VW beat up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him, kind of jokingly, yeah, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report. Sure enough, a couple days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's no sign of Charles. There's nothing. There's no anything about Charles. And his father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area, found nothing. So nothing is found. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake, and they get lost. They take a wrong turn, and they're well off the trailhead, and they discover a backpack. In the backpack, they found a strange-looking Volkswagen key that anyone that knew Charles McCullough knew that he had this strange key. And so when they found it, it was a distinctive key. And so when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCullough's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailhead. So this is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCullough. So they found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground, but his pants were still there. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull, and that is the last thing they find of Charles McCullough. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that, however, when you look at some of the circumstances. We have, he's missing his jacket, he's missing his boots, he's missing his photography equipment, his head is detached from his body. He was also 12 miles off the trailhead, and when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type, and even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes, and that was that. Bart Schleyer was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. He was just one of those people that you could drop into any environment and he's not only going to survive, he's going to thrive. A testament to that would be he spent months in Siberia tracking and catching Siberian tigers. He was like a world-renowned tiger tracker. He's just like this super rugged, super competent outdoorsman. In September of 2004, Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory in Canada for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. He had all the right equipment, he was obviously extremely capable, and no one thought twice about it. When he got dropped off, he told the pilot, meet me back here in 3 weeks. And so off he went. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now the pilot knew Bart was like a god in the wilderness, and so he wasn't really concerned, but he went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite, and it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag, which looked like it had an indent on it where someone might have been sitting on it up against a tree, and then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows, and it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose, but there was no Bart. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness, like he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open, And if a large predator had come through like a bear, after, it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia. And they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all 4 of them. And Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to just, for a quick second, make sure Chris was still there. And as they're walking along with no sound or any indication that anything's happened, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. A few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other 2, and they go, and they're like, where did Chris go? They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, maybe he stepped off the trail, but they can't see him. And they go back they start walking down the road towards where he would have been, and they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there's a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. One of his boots was stuck in the barbed wire, and there was nothing else. They searched the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him. And it didn't make any sense to the people in the survey crew, especially the guy who was third in line, who was like, I literally saw him a minute ago. And there's no way he could have gotten away without me hearing or seeing some indication of where he was. But there was no sign of him, and he was gone. So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of him. And that's it. They're just like, yeah, he's gone. They did find, 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories, where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see where they went. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases in Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away what these strange disappearances are from or what's causing them. Whether or not we ever find a definitive conclusion remains to be seen, but I would love to hear what you think is going on inside of these strange cases of Missing 411, whether it's a rational explanation or maybe something paranormal or some other option. But I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And that's going to do it, guys. If you enjoyed this, please, if you could, gently lambast the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads every week. If you want to get in touch with me, please DM me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, and my username is MrBallen over there as well. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care. No matter whether you believe this tragedy is the result of something paranormal or something normal and rational and explainable, no matter which way you feel, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the details of the story itself, the actual facts of the story, are horrifying. What actually happened to this poor family in the 1920s it's just one of the more terrifying ordeals that I've ever come across, and it's crazy to me that it's a true story. Without giving too much away, someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. One of the maids starts hearing strange sounds. They start looking for this person or this thing. They start seeing things moving around in their house, and there's every indication that someone is in the farm. Someone has snuck into the farm and is terrorizing us. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the dark, strange, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then my channel is the one for you. That is literally all I do on this channel, and I upload 3 to 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, I would ask you to gently 360 no-scope the like button, subscribe, and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid and the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azelia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Joseph and Azelia as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921. When some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she was alone a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls. Not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping, but she couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food, there was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas, he'd be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. And so she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched. And at night, I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. And so they're kind of thrown for a loop because they have to replace her. And so she leaves, and now they need to go find a replacement. Over the following 6 months, they would not find a replacement, and it would create an increased workload for basically everybody on the farm, which led to a higher stress level. Everybody's kind of on edge. You know, the departure of the live-in maid was a really big deal. And so you got to put that in perspective as you hear what happens over the next 6 months. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. You know, they were so busy that they didn't even have time to consider if there was any sounds in the house that they didn't recognize. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the footsteps. And despite checking and now searching the whole property, like they've begun to like actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other for like becoming paranoid. And so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. What was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Most notably, a set of their house keys went missing. And there's only so many people there. There's really not a good answer as to why they might go missing, and they only have a couple sets. It's a big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. And it was terrifying. And then when young Azalea, one of the grandchildren, suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is in full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what even happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They brought her back to the house, and they're trying to get her to explain why you were doing that. She can't. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that Andreas didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper, and it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound, and so it was strange to them that someone had been so violent with this lock, like hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs had heard it, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in the spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and he opens it up, and he can clearly see that there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he has now just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return set of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. His wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They say, hey, we've been asleep. We have no idea. So now Andreas, he's obviously thinking about the strangeness that's happened in his house over the past couple of months. And so he's worried. So he opens the door back up and he looks and he's studying these footprints and he's like, I just don't get it. You have to turn around and walk back. Otherwise you're here, you're at the house. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which it's scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, he does a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in his house. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. He's looking everywhere. There's nothing. There's no one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked. And he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. And he walks all the way to the forest, and they just kind of stop abruptly. Like they just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line and walked right up to his house, but there's no clear origination besides it's just in the forest somewhere. And there's also no clear sense of what happened once they arrived at the door. So after doing one more loop around his property, he goes in the barn, he goes in the shed, he goes back in his house, he's checking the attic, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. And so they did have a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but a couple hundred yards away. And he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. I've been hearing sounds. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds. We looked in the attic. We couldn't find anything. Then we started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests like, hey, I have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself? And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. I'm probably overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. But it would turn out he was not just fine, and he probably should have taken up Lorenz on the offer. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news, which was they finally were able to locate another maid, a live-in maid, to come stay with them to replace the one who had left because she believed the place was haunted. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this new maid shows up to Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Without telling anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Blow to the head and they're down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there, would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn, and then cover them with hay. And then as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family are being lured into this barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. They weren't scared when they went in, their guard was down, and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked, and he can see lights on inside, he can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm, so he didn't need them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is, he does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog that was barking, that was inside the house, is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door and someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door, and the back door that clearly must have just been opened to let the dog out is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. And so instead of just leaving, he finishes the job with the feeder, and he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted me to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside, then it was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't get in touch with them. But it prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because they haven't seen him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked, and they see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and they find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. Although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside, they played with the dog, they milked the cows. I mean, they lived in this house. They ran the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors would even say that, yeah, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it was confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well then it was probably a drifter. Target of opportunity, they probably saw this isolated farm, and they probably were gonna rob them, stay there a little bit, and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, there were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, like barely hidden, that had not been taken. And anybody that was robbing the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leaves maybe a crime of passion, but they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in the town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor. And in fact, he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas had told him outright no, and they thought that that could be a reason. But like the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the primary suspect is, he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of. And so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to solve it. They don't really have any decent suspects. And so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards and then vanished. And to this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it just wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery. So like any other high-profile unsolved mystery, there are literally hundreds of potential explanations for what could have happened. But what I'm most interested in is what you all think could have happened. I will do my best to look through your comments, and I'll respond to the ones that are the most interesting or the most plausible. So please, if you would, in the comment section, let me know what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. And if you haven't already, please gently 360 no scope the like button, and then please also subscribe and turn on all notifications so you get more content just like this in the days to follow. That's gonna do it, guys. I hope this was interesting. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is johnballen416. And I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there as well. And that's gonna do it, guys, and I will talk to you soon. One of the most terrifying movies I have ever seen has got to be The Exorcism of Emily Rose. What really made it scary was that it was based on a true story. The true story of Anneliese Michel, who was a 23-year-old girl living in Germany in the 70s, who was apparently possessed by demons. And there's a lot of audio recordings and some pretty incredible firsthand testimony of what happened to this poor girl. There's one scene in particular that, while it is a dramatization of what happened to Anneliese, it is certainly an accurate portrayal of what did ultimately physically happen to Anneliese Michel, and it is one of the most hair-raising, horrifying scenes in movie history, in my opinion. It is just downright disturbing. And so today, I'm going to be looking at the real story that movie is based on, which is, of course, the exorcism of Anneliese Michel. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, then you've come to the right channel, because that is literally all I do. And I upload 3, sometimes 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, if you could, please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Anneliese Michel was born in 1952 in Western Germany to a fiercely religious family. Devout Catholics who believed in some of the more extreme elements of the Catholic faith. Now, one of the things that they believed in and certainly pushed on to Anneliese and her siblings was this idea that sin could not be atoned on your own. It would require other people effectively sacrificing on your behalf for you to be absolved of your sin. And so Anneliese and her siblings would be instructed by her parents to, at times in the winter, sleep on the hardwood floor. In order to repent for sinners that can't repent for their sins on their own. And so she'd be laying on the floor in the middle of the winter, thinking that what she was doing was saving other people from their own sin. In 1969, Anneliese would have her first seizure. She was at school, she suddenly started seizing up and convulsing, and her classmates would later tell investigators and her family that it was almost like she'd entered into a trance-like state while she was having this seizure. And then as soon as the seizure had ended and she was done convulsing, she snapped out of the trance-like state. It wasn't until a year later when Anneliese had another seizure in the middle of the night. She had this convulsion and her parents come in and she's in this trance-like state and she's wet the bed and then she snaps out of it and she doesn't know what happened. It wasn't until this second seizure that the family actually sought medical attention. They actually went to a neurologist. That neurologist would tell Anneliese and her family that what she was suffering from was something called temporal lobe epilepsy, where, amongst a litany of horrible side effects, a few of the more significant ones are serious auditory and visual hallucinations, a loss of awareness, and intense mental state. So Anneliese was prescribed medication by this neurologist to try to combat this temporal lobe epilepsy, but it didn't seem to do anything. And in fact, her seizures and convulsions and this trance-like state she would go into during the seizures, it only persisted and intensified. And it got to a point where Anneliese and her family believed the best thing for her to do would be to go to a psychiatric hospital where the staff there was better equipped to handle what was happening to her. And so she checks in willingly, and they start experimenting with different drugs, and nothing seems to work. And in fact, her condition only gets worse. She starts having more seizures and more convulsions, and she starts having a regular visual hallucination. Whether she's having a seizure or not, everywhere she looked, if she looked at anybody in the face, their face would become demonic. Like it would be a demon's face that would look at her and say, "You're going to rot in hell." And so she began not being able to look at people in the face, and she would tell the nurses and doctors, like with her head down, about these demon faces she was seeing. And it was the first time she began espousing this idea that she was in fact possessed by demons. In fact, 6 demons by her count. When she passed on that information to her family that she believed she was possessed, she and her family believed that the psychiatric hospital was not enough, and in fact modern medicine was really not enough to handle what was happening to her, that they would need to search for help outside of medicine, and so they turned to the Catholic Church. Initially, all the clergy that Anneliese and her family approached to try to help her with the situation rejected her request, and they said, "You need to seek medical attention. This is not something we can help you with." Not knowing where to turn, her family is kind of at a loss. At the same time, Anneliese's condition really nosedives. I mean, it was already pretty bad. It gets a lot worse. She began doing 400 plus squats every day, like compulsively doing squats. Then she began going under the table periodically and not coming out for 2 days, barking like a dog the entire time without sleeping. She began going to corners of the house and finding spiders and eating them off the ground. She would scurry over to the fireplace and pull coal out of the fireplace and eat the coal. I mean, she was really losing it. Finally, the family located a priest named Ernst Alt who believed she was possessed and that she was not epileptic, and he was willing to petition the local bishop to allow the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism. And so that bishop granted permission for a local priest, Arnold Renz, to perform an exorcism with the full endorsement of the Catholic Church. Over the next 10 months, Renz would conduct 67 exorcisms of Anneliese. And through these exorcisms, Anneliese would reveal that she was being possessed by 6 demons: Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Nero, Fleischmann, and Adolf Hitler. And so all of these voices, these demonic voices that were coming out of Anneliese, they were picked up on audio recording during the exorcisms. And in the movie, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, the most iconic scene in the movie is the demon scene where they show off these voices coming out of, in the movie it's Emily Rose, but it's supposed to represent Anneliese Michel. And they do a fantastic job showing what that might have looked like during the exorcism. So take a look.
Give me your name, demon!
Names! Names! Moderator Armian Shashika!
Ancient serpents! Give Depart from this servant of God! Tell me your 6 names!
We are the ones who dwell within. Ni hushohen betokai Queen Hobby Tobbit in Roy Tesa Parothin in Udai Mikligyo Anablio. And I am Lucifer, the devil in the flesh.
And now I want you to take that scene you just watched of Emily Rose being possessed by these demons and think about that as you listen to the actual audio recordings of Anneliese Michel during one of her many exorcisms.
Ja, ich will auch für die anderen leiden, damit die nicht in die Hölle kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar, nee.
Nein, ihr Klötze! Und der Maul, ihr Klötze! Oh, und der Hanne will auch nicht.
Als Kind Gottes.
Ich hab dein Maul erschlagen! Die Ruhe! Ruhe gibt's nur da oben!
Ruhe gibt's nur dort, wo die Liebe ist.
Ja, bei uns gibt's nur ja nun. Die müssen in eigenen Seminaren ausgebildet werden, die dürfen nicht auf die anderen Universitäten. Kapiert?
Geist geboren hier auszufahren und nicht.
Initially, the exorcisms seemed to make things better for Anneliese. She got to a place where these seizures and convulsions and trance-like states and odd behavior were so few and far between that she actually re-enrolled in university and was even able to attend church, but it didn't last. In the spring of 1976, Anneliese's convulsions and seizures and odd behavior came back tenfold, and she began becoming violent with her family members to where they couldn't even be around her without being attacked by her. But when she was left on her own, she would harm herself. She stopped eating, saying that the demons were not allowing her to eat, and all day long she would stand up and then drop to her knees to pray, and then get back up and drop to her knees to pray, breaking both her kneecaps and tearing the tendons in her knees, which seemingly did not faze her. But still, her family believed that what she needed was religious intervention, not medical intervention. Also, Anneliese felt the same way, but some might say that she was not in a position to make that decision, that she had lost her ability to make that decision. But either way, they continued with the exorcisms. The final exorcism of Anneliese took place on June 30th, 1976, and while Anneliese did submit willingly to this exorcism, she was incredibly frail. She weighed under 100 pounds, and by the following morning, on July 1st, 1976, she had passed away due to dehydration and malnutrition. She was only 23 years old. After her death, Anneliese's story was so sensational that it grabbed headlines all over Germany, and people were clamoring to learn more about how this could happen. That she was, apparently possessed and then died after all these exorcisms. Why wasn't there medical intervention? There was so many questions. And so ultimately what happened is her parents were charged with negligent homicide, but were actually not given a jail sentence because at the time in Germany, they ruled that the parents had already suffered enough, so they did not serve any jail time. And there were 2 priests, one of them being Renz, who were charged with negligent manslaughter, and they were sentenced to 6 months in jail. That was later suspended. To this day, people are absolutely split down the middle about what actually happened to Anneliese Michel. Was it possession, or was it, like the neurologist said, a form of epilepsy, or was it something else? And furthermore, was psychiatric treatment or was modern medicine doing enough to help her? Or were they failing just as much as the exorcisms ultimately failed? it's a question that to this day people are really unsure how to answer. Her gravesite has become sort of like a monument for many churches around Europe. They will go and basically make the pilgrimage to her gravesite to pay their respects to a girl that they believe in some way died for their sins. So what do you think this was? Was this demonic possession, or was this epilepsy? Or was it something else? And how do you think they should have treated this case? I mean, obviously the medication she was on was not making it any better, but at the same time, the exorcisms didn't seem to do much better either. So how do you treat something like this? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I possibly can. All right, that's gonna do it, guys. If you were interested in this story and like this type of content, if you would please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe to this channel and turn on all post notifications so you can get the 3 to 4 weekly uploads that happen on this channel every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is johnballen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen as well. That's going to do it, guys. Until next time, see ya. There's a good reason why so many movies that are designed to be scary are set in the woods. Really, the woods at night. And if you go even further, most of them are like a cabin in the woods at night, right? It's because being in the woods at night, as human beings, checks a lot of fear boxes. You have the isolation factor. You're far away from society. That scares us. We don't want to be isolated. You feel more vulnerable that way. You know, it checks the darkness fear factor. As humans, we're mostly afraid of the dark because you don't know what's around you or what's looking at you. You know, you don't have the advantage of, you know, city lights beaming in. You're kind of probably removed from lots of light pollution, so you're kind of like in total darkness. And I think the third fear check in the box would be the fact that it's easy to hide in the forest. You don't know what's watching you because there's trees everywhere. You have animals, predators potentially, or even predatory humans that could be hiding at every turn. Hollywood has picked up on that and made bunches of movies of, you know, the whole cabin in the woods trope where somebody's isolated and scared in the woods because it works. It's something that we are afraid of. And so today's story starts off a lot like all the other kind of cliche cabin in the woods scary stories, but this one, it's different. This one scared the heck out of me because as I read the account of what happened in this cabin in the woods, I imagined myself being in this guy's position and thinking about the psychological trauma that this would have on you. And I've actually had a literal cabin in the woods scary experience, and you can check it out. It's one of my top videos on my YouTube channel. It's What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. You can check it out. It's my own cabin in the woods story. But having been through something like that, I was able to put myself in this guy's position, and this story terrifies me. So as you're listening to today's story, try to put yourself in this guy's position and think to yourself, what would you have done? But before we get into today's story, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, and mysterious that I'm going to deliver to you in a story format, if that's kind of your thing, I would ask you to please gently obliterate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of these strange, dark, and mysterious uploads that I do every week. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2010, a 17-year-old boy is devastated to find out that his father had suddenly passed away. And it really sent shockwaves through the whole family. Not only because now they're grieving the loss of their father, their husband, but because so much of their daily lives they spent together. I mean, this was a very close family, and one of the things that they liked to do as a family was they owned a cabin. It was around Mount Bachelor in Oregon, this beautiful mountain where you can go snowboarding and skiing. They had this family cabin up there where in the wintertime, this family would spend a lot of time there. They would go up there as a family, spend time there as a family. It was this wonderful retreat. And as they're trying to settle the estate of their husband, their father, they're trying to figure out what they want to do with this cabin, because all of a sudden this place that, you know, used to bring them so much joy and was a place of very fond memories suddenly felt kind of hollow. You know, it just would never be the same. And so they decided that they were actually going to sell this cabin. And the 17-year-old boy was just really upset about this. You know, He was very close with his father. He had some very fond memories of going hunting and skiing and snowboarding with his dad at this cabin. And so once the cabin was actually put up for sale by this boy's mother, he asked if, before they actually sell it, could he spend some time up there, I guess paying his respects in a way to his father. But he just wanted one more opportunity to spend some time in that cabin. And his mom said, go for it, take as many days as you want, go up and hang out in the cabin. But when you come back, we are going to sell the place. So his father had actually willed to his son his vehicle. And so the 17-year-old boy loads up his father's car. He goes out and he buys some snacks and drinks, heads up to the cabin in Oregon with the family dog whose name was Midnight. And his plan was just to go up to this cabin and basically try to enjoy being in this space one last time. Don't think about it as this place that now has no meaning because his father had died, but rather a place that he wanted one last positive memory before it was forever gone from their family. And so he gets up there, makes his way to the cabin, and he settles in for what turned out to be an abbreviated stay at the cabin. So in order to understand this story, we need to talk a little bit about the layout of the cabin itself. The cabin was 2 stories, and it was built into a mountain, Mount Bachelor in Oregon. And so the back half of the cabin was kind of settled into the mountain. So there were no windows, save a little sliver of window that fed into the bathroom, actually, in the back of the cabin. The front of the cabin was this beautiful, double-decker cabin with, windows on the second floor that fed into the master bedroom. On the second floor, there was a walk-out balcony that kind of jutted out a few feet from the second deck. The first floor, you could see in through all these beautiful windows. There was a sitting area, like a living room and a TV, and then a small kitchen as well. So the cabin was built in an area that was heavily forested. So they had to clear out, a bunch of trees to even build this cabin when the family had this built years and years ago. And so they really only cleared away the front section of trees so that there was a clear shot to the house, but the sides and the back were very heavily forested with these huge tall pine trees. And they basically had this little tiny driveway that fed in through all the trees, and you had this one kind of clearing in front of the cabin. So if you were on the second floor of the cabin, where there's the master bedroom, there's a bed up there, and you were looking out that window, you'd be looking over the balcony out into a clearing, basically. But there's a tree line, 100 yards past that clearing that's very dense. And there's actually a couple of trees, fairly prominent trees, that are sitting in front of the cabin that they did not cut down. One of which, for the story, we'll call it the sitting tree. Parallel to the ground, about 20 feet up, was this beautiful branch that looked perfect for a whole bunch of people sitting on it. But it was 20 feet above the ground, and there wasn't really any way to climb up to it, and no one was trying to climb this tree. But there's this tree that basically has a seat, if you will. Like the branch is like a seat that is looking directly into the cabin. And that's going to matter later in the story. So clearing in front of the cabin with this one kind of sitting tree, and then a very dense forest 360 degrees beyond, that one clearing. So when the 17-year-old gets to the cabin, he goes inside, he puts his drinks in the fridge, puts his snacks on the counter, he hooks up his PlayStation to the TV, and he's just like having a great time. His dog Midnight is roaming around, enjoying being at the cabin. And, he's having a great time. And over the course of the first 2 days that he was there, it was everything he hoped it would be. It was like he was bonding with his father one last time. It was a peaceful time that he was there. He was happy to be there. And he was just enjoying himself, eating snacks and playing video games for a couple of days. He actually left a couple times to go snowboarding too. But on the 3rd day that he was there, things started to get pretty weird. So on the 3rd day when he got up, it had snowed dramatically the night before. A couple of feet of snow on the ground, still snowing pretty heavily. And he's like, I just don't feel like brushing off my car and trying to go to the store or go to the slopes to go snowboarding. I'm just gonna basically be shut in for the day. And he was excited about it. He's like, great, me and my dog Midnight can bomb around the inside and play some more video games and eat some more snacks and do whatever. Midday that day, Midnight needed to pee, so he went outside with Midnight and let Midnight run around and go to the bathroom. And while he's out there with his dog, he notices there are some footprints in the snow that looked relatively fresh. And this is the first time that he's left his cabin that day, so they aren't his. And his neighbors were pretty far away, and he figured that they were older, that they were probably not going to be trekking around the woods. So he's thinking to himself, I wonder who made these footprints. And he's looking at them, and they started in the woods. So the woods are not that far away from where he is. He's in a relatively small clearing just in front of his cabin. But he can tell these fresh footprints have come out of the woods. And they're basically right in front of this clearing. And he notices that they bank around and go to the back of his cabin and kind of go up onto the mountain. And he kind of just starts walking and following the footprints a bit, and they kind of disappear up onto the mountain behind his cabin. And he's not overly concerned or anything, but he definitely takes note that more than likely somebody was walking around his cabin. Maybe it was someone who got lost, maybe it was a neighbor. I mean, he's rationalizing it. He's thinking, you know what? It can't have been anything too serious. Obviously, they didn't knock on my door. They didn't need anything. And so he kind of writes it off. So that night, he stays up late playing video games, and his dog is sleeping next to his chair. And at some point, he's tired and he wants to go to bed. So he draws all the curtains, so blackout curtains around the downstairs, shuts all the blinds, and locks all the windows, all the doors, and heads upstairs to the lofted second floor where the master bedroom is. He gets in bed, turns off all the lights, everything's locked, everything's shut, the dog climbs into bed, and the dog would sleep up near his head. And suddenly the dog jumps up, still on the bed, and looks at the stairs leading downstairs to the front door. And its ears are perked up like it's heard something. And it wasn't unusual for the dog to be a little jumpy, maybe it heard something. He wasn't overtly concerned. But when midnight, the dog jumps off the bed and sprints downstairs after having this sudden alertness. And he's listening. Now he is a little bit worried. He's thinking, well, I saw footsteps yesterday walking around my cabin, and now it's the middle of the night and my dog is downstairs acting like it's heard something. And he hears the dog, Midnight, pacing around the downstairs, like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Every indication is the dog wants to go outside. That's the noises that he's picking up, that signal from the dog. And so finally, even though he's feeling a little bit unnerved by this, he decides to go down and see what Midnight wants. And so Midnight is by the door, ears perked up, very eager to go outside. It's pacing, and he thinks, you know what, she just needs to go to the bathroom. And so he opens the door with Midnight and he goes outside and he expects his dog to pee. But Midnight doesn't need to pee. Midnight starts kind of stalking around the corner and looking out across the clearing towards the sitting tree in that direction, and it just stops. And it's looking at something very intently, as if it spotted an animal or something in the woods. And so the boy is looking at the dog, and he's kind of trying to encourage the dog to do its business so they can go back in the cabin. And he's starting to feel really uncomfortable. He's looking around. He's thinking like, okay, I don't know what's going on. Like, I'm a little bit concerned now. And he's sensing that Midnight is going at some point to try to take off after whatever she sees in the woods. And so preemptively, he grabs Midnight and says, all right, drags Midnight back in the house and shuts the door and locks it and takes one last look out the window of the door and just kind of looks out. I mean, it's dark, he doesn't have a light or anything. And he's like, man, that's creepy. Locks it, shuts the blinds, confirms everything downstairs is locked, does a sanity check to make sure everything is locked, and goes back upstairs with Midnight. Midnight did not want to go back upstairs. He had to practically drag her back upstairs. And then when they did get back in bed, Midnight refused to get in bed, but instead stood next to the bed looking at the stairs, wanting to go downstairs, periodically looking back at him and then down at the stairs. Midnight wanted to go back outside. So he's laying there in bed and he's taking full stock of the fact that his dog is very much on edge, but he's trying to fall back asleep, trying to convince himself that nothing weird is going on. And after about 30 minutes of that and being unsuccessful at falling asleep, as he's laying there, it's silent, and all of a sudden he hears footsteps on his roof. Now, the roof is right above his head. I mean, he's on the second floor. There is no attic. The roof is right there. And he hears about 6 footsteps. And he actually described it as something with hooves. And his dog instantly looks up as well. And they're both watching the ceiling as what sounds like hooves walking along the roof of this cabin. And it was so distinctive that immediately what he's thinking to himself is, how could a deer or a moose or something get on the roof of the house? There is no way, unless you leapt from a tree or had a ladder, for you to get on the roof. And how did we not hear, if they leapt from a tree or a ladder even, how didn't we hear a loud slamming sound when they first landed on the roof? Like, it's as if they've been there for a while and we just didn't know. And so then the footsteps stop, and at this point the dog stops looking at the roof and goes right to the balcony, which is shut. There's a door shut to the balcony, and there's curtains drawn against the balcony, so he can't see what's out there. And so the 17-year-old boy is sitting in his bed, and he's like, oh, I don't want to see what's on the porch. And he even says in his write-up about this that he's like, you know, I'm a pretty tough guy, but I'm in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, totally isolated. Like, I almost don't want to know what's going on outside. I just want to pretend it's not happening. But at some point, he musters the courage to go out on the balcony. And so he walks over very timidly to the door, and midnight's there, ready to go outside. And he takes a deep breath and he slides open the blackout curtains. But there's no light outside and there's no light inside, so it's just kind of darkness. And he can barely make out even just the snow that's on the balcony right in front of him. And he takes a deep breath and he unlocks the door and he opens it up. And the first thing he does is he turns and he looks up at the roof to see if there's a deer or a moose or something on the roof. There's nothing up there, and he's kind of peering around, and he can't even see footprints up there. So in a way, he's kind of relieved, right? Like, I must have been imagining that. He had a flashlight, and so at this point, he's looking back at his roof of his cabin, and he shines the light real quick, and it's totally dark out, right? So this light goes very far, and he sees nothing. And the dog at this point, he can hear the dog making kind of some commotion below him. It's angling itself to look out in the direction of the sitting tree and out towards that tree line where the dog had originally been fixated on something in the tree line. And so just doing his diligence, the 17-year-old scans from the top of the roof where he sees nothing. He starts scanning over to the side of the house, right? Like, this is the direction of the sitting tree. He's looking over here, and he's looking, he's scanning the tree line, just looking for anything that might have been on the roof. And he's looking and he's looking and he's looking, and then he gets to the sitting tree. And his flashlight stops on a man crouched on that perch 20 feet off the ground on the sitting tree, who looked very tall. He had his hands holding onto the branch right above him, and his mouth is open. And he's holding onto the branch, and he's looking directly at the boy, unblinking, 100% focused on him. He's less than 50 yards away from him at this point. And it took him a second, the 17-year-old, to register what his flashlight was pointed at. And he panics and he drops it. And the dog reacts to the drop flashlight too. And because he's alone out here, he needs to protect himself, so he scoops that light back up and he shines it one more time to see, like, holy cow, like, what did I just see? And the guy on the branch is now gone. And he scans the ground. There's nothing. And he's terrified at this point, so he grabs his dog, throws Midnight back into the cabin, runs back in, shuts the door, locks it, closes the blinds, turns off his light, and literally gets back in bed with his dog, and he's now basically cowering on the bed. So at this point, they're sitting on the bed. Midnight is no longer acting like she wants to go outside. I think she's picking up potentially on the paranoia. Okay. At this point, the boy and his dog are sitting on the bed, and they're both scared at this point. Midnight, was fearsome while she was outside, but now that she's back inside, she doesn't want to go near the door either. She's rubbing up against him. She doesn't want to go anywhere. And they're sitting there, and the boy, all he's thinking to himself is, did I really just see that? It looked like an unnaturally tall man. How did he get in the tree? That's 20 feet off the ground. There's no way to get up into the tree. And why was it sitting there with its mouth open, staring at me? And who was on the roof? Was anything on the roof? And if this thing can get 20 feet up into a tree, it certainly can get on the roof of my cabin, I would imagine. But what was it? So he's having this type of thought process, and he's realizing too that it's not that late in the night. He still has hours until the sun's gonna come up. And as he's basically panicking and feeding off his own paranoia, and it's getting worse and worse by the second, he hears tapping on the door, on the front door of his cabin. And his heart sinks, and he and his dog kind of look in the direction of the tapping, and he knows he's not gonna go open the door. He knows the door is locked. He knows everything is locked. He's panicking that maybe it wasn't, but he knows he locked it. And the tapping just sounds like a finger tapping on the window. And at some point the tapping stops, and he thinks, okay, maybe they'll just go away. And then he hears what sounds like footsteps outside, and then tapping begins on the side of his cabin. Not the front door anymore, like the wall of the cabin. Now it's a little bit louder. The tapping continues up the side of the house, and then it stops. And he's sitting there and he's thinking, whatever this is walking around my cabin. And then he hears tapping on the little slit that is the window that feeds into the bathroom that's right behind the bedroom that he's in right now. So 6 feet away, maybe 10 feet away, whatever this thing is, it's now literally just a small pane of glass away, tapping on the glass. And so now he's petrified. And he's just hoping that this thing goes away. It doesn't. It goes to the other side of the cabin and starts tapping on the wall on the other side of the cabin and makes it all the way back to the front, where it begins tapping on the glass of the front window, back to the door. And he's just thinking, like, whatever this is walking around my cabin, tapping all over my cabin. And then all the tapping stops. And his heart's racing. You know, it's the middle of the night. He's in the middle of the woods somewhere. He's totally isolated. And then it's like his worst nightmare comes true. He hears footsteps on his balcony and then tapping right on the big sliding glass doors of the door leading out to the balcony. And he knows that right behind a blackout curtain and a pane of glass is this tall man, more than likely, who's right on his balcony. And the tapping on the balcony goes on and on and on. And then all of a sudden it stops. And he's just waiting for it to open the door and come inside. But it doesn't. Instead, it goes on the roof, and it starts tapping on the roof directly above him. And the tapping continues all night. And so finally, the sun comes up. You know, he hasn't slept all night, and he finally gets the courage to go over to the balcony and open up the curtains and see what's out there. And when he does, there is nothing out there, but there's footprints as if someone had been pacing on the balcony all night. He opens it up, and he finally just jumps out and looks up on his roof. There's nothing on his roof. He can see all these footprints on his roof. He looks down, and it's like a racetrack of footprints all around his house. Someone had been basically stalking his house all night, and then the footsteps retreat all the way to the sitting tree and then go back into the woods. He packed up his stuff, he left, and he couldn't have been happier that the family sold that cabin, because he was never going to go back. So to this day, he has no idea what it was. And even if it was just a person who was tapping on your windows and your walls and your roof and your balcony, even if it was just a human being doing that, that would be horrifying, let alone if it was something else, something paranormal. And so if you want to check out my video about my experience, it's on my channel called What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. It's eerily similar to the one that I just described of the 17-year-old in Oregon. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think was doing all that tapping, and if it's possible that was just some person screwing with this poor kid, or maybe it was something else. So let me know in the comments, and I'll try to get back to as many people as I possibly can. If you haven't already, please, if you like this story, gently obliterate the like button and subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you can get 3 to 4 videos just like this every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is johnballen416. I'm also quite active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen over there, and I go live on there all the time, 10 o'clock Eastern, most days of the week. So I hope to see you in one of those other places, and I hope you'll continue to watch my videos here on YouTube. And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much. Till next time.